This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This episode is sponsored by gardencourses.com. Gardencourses.com offers online horticultural training for those looking to develop their own home gardens. The latest course to be added is Create Your Garden Sanctuary. You can go to gardencourses.com to find out more. This week I'm talking head gardeners with Ambra Edwards. Why she chose the ones she did to feature in her book of that name, diverse range of tasks they undertake, and what makes a good one. My first question to Ambra was what prompted her to write a book about some of the legendary and some of the unsung heroes of the horticultural world.
Well, I think two things really. That I'd worked as a garden journalist for quite a few years and quite often had this experience of sort of wandering around some fine garden, with a grande dame with a truck who didn't kind of seem to know what was in her own garden. So she'd waft about and then she'd go in and then I'd have to go and find the head gardener to find out what was really going on. And that did happen more than once. So I had the experience of meeting head gardeners year in, year out, and rarely met one who I didn't find impressive in some way. And what was particularly interesting was all the different understandings that these people brought to their jobs. So they had very different ideas of what their core role was. So in some cases it might be commercial, some were more planty, some were more socially orientated, some were garden historians, some were artists, so on and so forth. But at whatever the emphasis was, there was this sort of vast range of skills. I mean, I always think it's difficult to find another job where you need so many diverse skills, unless possibly being a vicar. And it's so I would meet these impressive people from week in, week out. And then I suppose the sort of final thing was, I don't know if you remember this, but one David Cameron, in one of his many lapses of judgment, in around about 2011, something like that, made a speech in which he had the cracking idea that the way you would solve long-term unemployment would be to send people on community schemes doing really useful things like litter picking or gardening, as if they were one and the same. And I just found that so offensive that that gardening should be equated with some kind of janitorial work. That I'm really quite cross about it. It's not my pen. So it was a combination of all those things. But just really. And then when, of course, I started to think about it and thought, well, gosh, here are all these people I've met over the years. Who are so different, and every one of them interesting, and every one of them impressive. So that's how we got going.
Yeah, I mean they are different. They're so diverse. How did you choose the gardeners that you included in the book?
Well, that was difficult in a sense that you could have made a book that was 3 feet thick, because there were so many deserving candidates. And there are so many brilliant people who aren't in there, and every now and then I think, oh no, if only. But it was just trying to find a range of different approaches. So, choosing some who are more interested in wildlife, some who are more interested in the sort of artistic element, some who are more driven by the history, some who are project managers, and also people who had extraordinarily strong stories, like Paul Pulford, whose life was turned round by gardening, like Carol Sales, who turned other people's lives round by gardening, like Martin Ogle, who, at the time that I met him first, was running the biggest restoration project in Europe with just literally no money. They were holding plant stalls. He had a little group of volunteers, raising 20 quid here, 20 quid there to try and keep the garden going. Lowther has now moved on to great and wonderful things. But I just thought, God, the sheer tenacity of this young man to keep going in the face of all this, just so impressive. And then you have the people who are really, really admired by their peers, like Mick Evans, who has essentially reinvented the herbaceous border for the 21st century. Incredibly modest man. And the wonderful Fergus, who's turned Great Dixter into a kind of horticultural Harvard, really, and spares no energy, spares himself nothing to try and promote not just Dixter as a place, but a whole way of life that it represents, a whole kind of understanding of the joy and the importance of gardening. And then you have people who you think, you're doing what? Like the wonderful Beatrice Crail, engaged to train bindweed up poles, who has a cheery relationship with Ground Elder. And so it's really, really interesting. So yeah, there was no end of people to think about. And then also I wanted to bring, the difference between people working for trust gardens, as, Troy was then working for Sissinghurst, Mick for Packwood, and people working in private service like Andrew Woodall, who's made this incredibly impressive garden at Broughton Grange, and Michael Walker at Trentham. Again, an incredible range of skills that man has, not only to conduct this massive restoration, the biggest before Lowther, but then to run this essentially sort of multi-million pound sort of enterprise. And you think, and this is equated with litter picking.
Yeah.
Go on.
Crazy. Well, this could be a redundant question then, because it sounds as if they are such a massively diverse group of people. Did you notice any kind of common traits or things that you would say that is typical head gardener behaviour?
Yeah, I think so. I think every one of them, not surprisingly, said, you don't do this job for the money. It isn't really a job so much as a lifestyle choice. And so every one of them in their different way was just incredibly passionate about what they were doing. And, obviously you wouldn't do it if you weren't. So yeah, absolutely, they all shared that. And actually quite a lot of them said, if you said, well, what qualities do you need? They would quite often, despite their very different approaches, come up with a few of the same things. Like, if you're going to be a decent gardener, above all, you have to be really vigilant. You have to pay attention. You have to go around, you have to check on everything, you have to be aware of what needs doing, and you have to be timely, so you have to pay attention, and you can't then just let it drift. You have to get on with it, which is a life lesson for us all. It rubbed off on me.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
And so I think that very much, and and then all of them aware of, without getting sort of airy-fairy, sort of hippie-ish about it, but the extraordinary power of gardening in so many dimensions. The mental, the psychological, and even the spiritual dimension that it brings to people's lives. So it's not just practical work with your hands, as it were. It's hugely more than that.
Yeah, and I did get the impression that the gardeners had to be good at a lot of different things. Were there any really unexpected roles that the head gardeners took on that you found when you were writing the book?
Well, yes. I mean, first of all, it's all the technical stuff that if you're managing these projects that you've got to know a lot about health and safety and building regs and machinery safety and all that kind of stuff. You think, gosh, the paperwork that you have to go through, particularly when gardens are open to the public and there's this sort of massive bureaucracy surrounding that. But I suppose, right at the other end of the scale, that they had to be so kind of managerially and psychologically adept. So a lot of these people are working either with groups of volunteers or in a way, it's slightly different, but offering services to people ranging from children from special schools to various service users. So whether it's Paul taking a lot of people who are homeless and have addiction problems to work in a London cemetery, or whether it's people welcoming kids from the local Borstal, I don't think you call it that anymore, from special schools to work in the garden, like Martin when he started clearing Lowther was using the probation service. Kids were coming in there and helping people who have physical or mental difficulties. Those are very, very specialist skills to learn. To learn to manage that and to learn to, use those people to get the best for the garden and use the garden to get the best for the people. That's a subtle skill, isn't it? I'm not sure that's something they teach you at horticultural college, So that was really impressive that people could do that. And then, and taking that, right the way along the line to see someone like Carol Sales, using what she called horticultural skills to provide therapy by stealth. Was that was wonderfully inspiring. We said, well, we're just going to pick some flowers, and actually that's really, really good for your balance. Or you're going to reach up to pick some apples, and that's and that's very good for your sort of upper body strength. And you're going to prick out some seeds, and that's really, really good to develop your fine motor skills. All of that, yeah, that's really clever.
Yeah, it is.
And all very quietly without making to do about it. And you just thought, that's really great. And and then I think also a lot about confidence building. And that was something that you would see, say, somewhere like Dixter, where you have maybe people who've come to gardening because they've been told, not that it's the best career in the world, but it's the only career you can do, because you're either a bit of an academic dimwit, or you are emotionally fragile, or you're sort of ridiculously, you're dyslexic, you can't spell, so you'll never do anything. So people have had their confidence perhaps knocked, and then showing them how they can do something that is really creative, really worthwhile, really complex, and make spectacular achievements, achieve spectacular success. I think that's a great thing, because I think some of the people now who are our star gardeners, who aren't necessarily in this book, wouldn't it be lovely if you could do a volume 2? I
was just going to ask you that, yeah.
Didn't necessarily realise quite well. I mean, they didn't necessarily realise what great things they'd achieved.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Sort of when you were talking there, I thought, how much does somebody have luck and land in a garden that suits their personality? How much do they learn to kind of fit the role? And sometimes when you get these head gardeners that just make it work, is it that perfect marriage of they've been able to mould the role to what they want to kind of do and what interests them, and also the role did already kind of have those things inherent to it? It's a really interesting question, because it wouldn't be everybody's cup of tea to take on a managerial role, for example. But also you've got the medium of the garden, which is like a natural classroom to any and everyone that goes into it. And that through that, you can kind of find yourself, I think, doing things and achieving things that you wouldn't necessarily have been able to, or thought that you would be able to in other circumstances. So that sort of brings me on in a long-winded way to my next question, which was, how much are gardens the expressions of the personalities of the head gardener?
Well, that depends, I suppose, very much where they're working, because, the head gardener has an employer. So the successful gardens are where the head gardener and the employer are working in sync, and have a really good understanding. And perhaps that relationship isn't that direct. So if we look back to when Troy Scott Smith was at Sissinghurst, Sissinghurst at that time had a succession of lady gardeners following on from Vita, who had developed this garden into the sort of pinnacle of horticultural perfectionism, this pinnacle of horticultural achievement. But there was a feeling, I suppose, when Troy went there, he felt that something had been lost, and something of the romance, the exuberance, the lyricism of Vita's original garden had been lost. And he was working hard to try and put that back. So in a sense, a relationship there, yes, his nominal employer is the National Trust, but in a sense he's looking back to that figure and trying to make her understanding of the garden live again. I think that was very personal for him. That was very personal. That was clearly was Vita's personal relation, or Vita and Harold together. So that's very much where one person goes in with a clear vision. I think it's probably easier for gardeners who don't work for big organisations to have more freedom to do what they want in the garden. But equally, one of the things that they would complain of was that as a head gardener, you were also required to be the security guard, the chauffeur, the one who locks the toilets up. They were
possibly cleaned them.
Yeah. I can remember what I'm telling him. When he'd been working in one garden, it was his job to go and buy loo rolls. That part of gardening. So it is, yes. In the most successful way, when it works really, really well, it will be a symbiosis, and that's not necessarily a easy or relationship, because one of the things I really enjoyed was meeting Alistair Clark at the Garden of Cosmic Speculation at Portrack, whose boss had been with Maggie and Charles Jenks, and Maggie had died some years before, and it was an inspiration really that all those wonderful which the garden is well known, and her husband Charles Jenks had developed that. He had been making these landforms in various gardens and various installations around the world. But the man who actually built these things was Alistair Clark. And Alistair Clark had been working there since he was 15 years old as a garden boy. And in his early 20s, he's had no greater desire than to carry on working in the greenhouses, growing spectacular veg and breeding prize begonias. suddenly his life is changed completely, and he starts building things that are expressions of astrophysics. And happily, he'd been very good at maths at school. but the relationship between these two men was really good. Could get quite, it was quite a ding dong. It was quite a battle. You had these two really, strong characters. The canny no nonsense Scot and the hugely academic, far-seeing, American, and they would have right old ding-dongs. It was really funny. So that relationship isn't, it isn't always perhaps the quietest one. And then, someone like, Lucille Savin, who worked at an Oxford college. And I just love the way that she sort of quietly subverting the idea of what a quad ought to look like, sort of planting up all these wonderful pots of bananas and exotics and all these things. So, it's a really, really interesting planting in a place we think, well, nothing here has changed for 500 years. I think, well, quietly it is. So, yeah. So, her employers were the college, Merton College, but they let her get on with it.
I do wonder how, or whether it is stifling for a head gardener to stick to historical plans or designs and not inject a little bit of their own creativity into a space.
I don't think any gardener, you cannot in any case stick slavishly to a historic design, because your garden grows, doesn't it? It outgrows its space. Some gets big, some get small. The thugs take over the thing. Gardens are dynamic things; they change all the time. And I think that's the great thing that happened at Packwood, which was not only to make these incredibly wonderful dynamic hot borders, which was a reinvention of a Victorian idea of how you would plant a border. It was called the mingled style border. But actually what Mick did there was find old plans and see that there had been a border that had linked one part of the garden with the house. And in fact, the removal of that border had sort of left this sort of pair of rather grand gates and an entrance so on floating a little bit. So he reinstated that. So he was working to a historical plan insofar as, that determined where this path was going to go with a border either side of it. But then what he did was create entirely new planting. And planting that was in tune with modern ideas. Equally, he's gone into the courtyards there and encouraged things to self-seed into the gravel and a much, much looser way of gardening those spaces. So the two, I think you can be respectful of a garden's history, but you cannot keep any garden in aspic. And it can be, I think, really very, inventive. And gardens never stood still, have they?
No, that's very true. Based on what you discovered writing the book, if you yourself had to hire a head gardener and you wanted to make sure that you got a really great one, could you say that there would be one or two particular traits that you would look out for?
Well, it's two things. One is you need there's not physical energy to get a lot of stuff done fast, because it's hard keeping up with stuff. But I think that capacity just to step back and look. It's that capacity to really, really look. And that's not only in terms of how can you say, horticultural management, plant management, has that rosebud got greenfly on it, does that need deadheading, has that thing fallen over, does that, do my seedlings need watering? There is all that vigilance as well. But also, that bigger picture thing. I mean, how is this garden sitting in the landscape? How is this part of the garden relating to that part? Has this part of the garden got out of balance? Because I think all of us as garden owners, we make a thing, we develop a garden and so on, and then it just grows, and it grows and grows, and it crowds out something else, and you kind of haven't noticed how big it is, because you just start kind of being getting on and say, oh God, no, that really doesn't look right. So it would be someone to supply, if you like, that kind of vision that you lack yourself. I think that's what I'd want.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So critically appraise the garden, and that's that, like Fergus, for example, who can actually, I think a lot of us gardeners tend to get caught up in, as you say, in, oh my God, there's a greenfly attack, but it's that ability to step back and say, okay, well, in the long run, what would be good and what would work and what would people like to see? And that's a really good point.
The courage to do it. Actually, the boughs of that tree have to come up. So those two bushes are bumping into each other. One of them's got to go. Yes. Which you certainly would, I'm so wussy at doing anything like that.
Well, me too. But also, a lot of head gardeners, especially if it's a public garden, have the added pressure of people, fellow gardeners or staff or colleagues or visitors saying to them, what have you done that for? Why are you doing that? I love that tree. Don't take that tree. But they have to have that sort of boldness to make those decisions, even though they may not be popular at the time. So, that is really important.
Yes, I mean, Michael Walker at Trenton took on this massive scheme to restore the Capability Brown landscape. And a lot of it had been obliterated just by conifer plantation. I mean, it wasn't like there was a beautiful ancient forest there that he was cutting down. But yes, he had spent a lot, there was a lot of outcry, and had spent a lot of time explaining himself to visitors and trying to get them on board with the vision of recreating this wonderful parkland. But that was by no means an easy thing to do.
Yeah, really interesting.
Another gardening skill, sort of perfect diplomacy.
Exactly, yeah. Well, God, these people are just gods, aren't they? I can't put it another way. So my final question is, and this is a bit of a flight of fancy, but if you could take the role of one of the head gardeners in the book, who would it be and why?
Oh my goodness. Oh, that is really, really, really hard. Oh, really torn.
You could do a job share. Pick two.
I think one, I think the thing that's going on at Lowther is absolutely incredible. So it's taking a garden that had really fallen into ruin, and it had that incredible romance. I mean, people will be familiar with the story of Heligan, when a garden just gets overgrown, and it's gloriously beautiful in its ramshackle and untoward way, but it is. He's fortunate there to have had a master plan by Dad Pearson to plant some of the ruins there in a way that makes a kind of nympha of the north. So beautifully clothing this ruin with planting, and that's coming along. But it's actually not so much there as the sort of wider landscape. Is how do you manage it so you bring it back to a point where it's some kind of a garden, but without losing that secret garden romance. And I think that is phenomenally difficult to do. Because I can remember Vita Stapford West said, there's nothing harder to maintain than sweet disorder. So I think that's an incredible gardening challenge, to keep that romance, to keep that poetry, but without, not over restoring it. At the same time, you've got the practicality of how do you manage it. It's really hard. But I think that's a phenomenal challenge to do that. And there's still masses of it that's still under woodland, under trees, that's still to be discovered. So that's really great. So I think that one's very wonderful. I wish I had the personal qualities to be a Paul Pulford or a Carol Sales, but I see not. I think those are very, very special people. In terms of a garden that is just beautiful, I think, Packwood House is very, very beautiful. Yes, during his time there, I think visitor numbers have gone through the roof. So, I don't know how you manage that you keep some of the mystery and enchantment of that garden when the footfall is so absolutely huge. But, I'd love to learn to plant a border like Mick Evans.
Yeah, we all. That is the end of my questions. Did we cover everything that you wanted to? Is there anything else you wanted to add?
I just wanted to make the point about the de-skilling of gardening, sort of following on from the, that it's not just outdoor housework. That if we go back to sort of 1822, and when John Loudon published his great encyclopedia, that he identified like 10 categories of gardeners, and he wrote that head gardeners were expected to know that they were expected not only to know all that there was in books, but must be in advance of knowledge. So, right back in the 1820s, he clearly sees gardening as a profession, and he talks about the skill and the application that is required, and the long years of training and arduous training and a vast range of skills, and what we would now call continuing professional development, that you have to keep up with what's going on and you have to visit other gardens and all of that. So right back in the 1820s, there's this understanding that this is a really demanding and really exacting job, and that these people are worthy of respect. And so I kind of think, well, how is it 100 years on, 200 years, that we've lost that? So why is it just a trade that anyone can get in a white van and call themselves a gardener and run around with a strimmer? And, it's not respected in the way that it was then. So, yeah. So we've got kind of 200 years worth of professionalism to catch up on.
Thank you to Ambra for talking about her fantastic book. It really is good, and I loved her writing style. And I was so impressed with the portraits she painted of these gardeners. Thanks to you for listening, and to gardencourses.com for sponsoring this episode. Now it's Dr. Ian Bedford with The Scourge of the Fruit Cage.
The common gooseberry sawfly can be a troublesome pest of gooseberry, red and whitecurrant bushes. In early spring, the adults, which have yellow bodies and black heads, emerge from pupae, having spent the winter months underground. They mate before the females fly off to lay their eggs on the underside of young leaves, usually within the centre of the bush and hidden from sight. The young larvae hatch and start voraciously feeding on the leaves, working their way upwards through the bush and defoliating the stems whilst they rapidly grow. After 2 to 3 weeks, these caterpillar-like larvae, which are green with black dots, are fully grown, and they descend down into the soil to pupate. If conditions are good, another 2 generations can occur before the end of the year. Controlling gooseberry sawfly in an environmentally friendly way is relatively easy if you keep a regular eye on the bushes. Disappearing leaves will indicate the location of the larvae, which can then be removed by hand. Regular turning over the soil around the base of the bushes will also help by exposing the sawfly pupae to insectivorous birds and other predators.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.